All right, everyone, and welcome to Ask an Austrian, a Mises Caucus podcast, where we invite Austro-libertarians on the podcast to answer your questions about libertarian theory, ethics, or just philosophy and economics. And today, I'm very excited to have Dr. St. Onge on the show. And we have a list of questions for you, and I want to dive right into them. So I'll bring him on right now. How are you doing? Thanks so much for coming on. Oh, it looks like you're muted.
2.5 years into the pandemic, and I haven't figured out the internet. It's great to be here, Liam. Thanks.
Yeah, well, why don't you just introduce yourself for everyone before we get into the questions?
Sure. I'm Peter St. Onge. I'm an economist at the Heritage Foundation. I'm also a fellow at the Mises Institute. I write about freedom and Bitcoin on Substack. And like many of us, I'm now active these days on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot of questions that I ran by you before we went live, and I hope to get to all of them. Also, I'll be watching the live chat. If there are any good ones that come up, if we have time, I'll ask Peter at the end. But the first question we have is from Sean Brown. He is asking, what is your best estimate of the amount of government intervention, taxes, regulations, tariffs, subsidies, monetary policy, immigration restrictions, the amount these restrictions and these interventions reduce our standard of living measured in GDP per capita?
So it's massive. The question is how far back you want to go. A logical starting point would be the progressive era, which began around the turn of the century, around 1900, 1910. Before then, we had the so-called Gilded Age in the late 19th century. Really, it was the Golden Age. It was socialist journalists who dubbed it so. And if we compare what happened after the sort of socialist onslaught of progressivism, okay, if we compare that to what the economy looked like before, then over that 100 years, you're talking something like 7 times poorer, okay? For perspective, Mexico is about 3 times poorer than the US, right? To get to a gap of 7x, you're going to maybe like the Philippines or Bolivia, right? So whatever your quality of life is nowadays, if we hadn't gone down that progressive rabbit hole, roughly we'd be about 7 times richer. That would mean that you'd make about $100 an hour working at Starbucks. People would probably retire in their mid-30s and go, read poems or whatever it is one does. Now, of course, that's just sort of straight line extrapolation because it's a big counterfactual, right? So if, for example, we hadn't had a Federal Reserve, then it's very unlikely that World War I would not have happened. Had World War I not happened, World War II, the Soviet Empire, right? There's a whole number of things that came out of that process, which fundamentally began with sort of the march of government, this enormous growth of government really across the Western world.
All right. Well, the next question that we have is from Donnie Letson, and he is asking, do you see uses for crypto?
The biggest is obviously money. So there I think Bitcoin is really kind of the final word. Money, of course, is a big deal because without fiat currency, government would probably, it would be a lot smaller than it is today, not just in absolute terms, right? Probably around half offhand if they couldn't just print the money they need. But again, you've got counterfactuals involved in that. So for example, the COVID lockdowns, right? If, say, the US government had not been able to print every dollar it needed, it would have never done the COVID lockdowns, right? They would have said, wait, we're going to have to lay off bureaucrats? Are you kidding? Are you out of your mind? No way we can lock it down, right? Because they would have been starved of tax revenue. So again, you have a lot of counterfactuals where, getting rid of fiat, I think, is probably bigger than half the game. Having said, there are a lot of other crypto applications that I do think are interesting, sort of in research and development sense. You have social media, decentralized finance, file storage, supply chain, uncensored internet browsing, like with Brave. I think those are great. I'm not against those projects. Just like, I like tools like Nostr or BitTorrent back in the day. Or anything decentralized, I love. However, I think a lot of the hostility against crypto in the Bitcoin community is looking at it as an investment. And there, I would absolutely say, do not put your life savings in these things. I'm glad they're there. Treat them as speculative investment. If you put $1 into non-Bitcoin crypto, I would say kiss it goodbye. It's probably not coming back.
Now that's related to another question that we got from Anonymous. It says, I am young and I have saved up a lot of money, but it is currently sitting in a regular savings account. I want to diversify. Some people suggest bonds, some suggest indexes, and others are saying to completely jump ship and put it all in Bitcoin, gold, and cash. Can I trust anything? Is it worth still incurring risk and investing in the stock market?
So I do still diversify. I love Bitcoin. A lot of my net worth is in Bitcoin, but I still do diversify. And the reason is because Bitcoin is extremely volatile. And it will remain volatile until it has much wider acceptance. Gold, by the way, right? Gold was stable for many hundreds of years. Since gold was demonetized, all right, gold has doubled or dropped in half several times over 1 or 2 years. So gold became super volatile, not because gold is inherently volatile, but because it's not money right now. So Bitcoin is in the same boat, but magnified, right? So Bitcoin will remain volatile until it becomes the most common currency. So in the meantime, you do have to diversify. Keep in mind, stocks are real, right? Nike, Apple Corporation, these are real things. They have, they're like little machines that usually make money. They're made of people and locations and brand names. So I think it's fine to diversify into stocks. You probably want to stay out of bonds or savings accounts just because those are not little machines that make money. They just erode predictably. And then, of course, the biggie is borrowing, right? So, one of the ways that the Fed screws with the economy is by subsidizing borrowing rates. And so if you can borrow, you should borrow. All right. Interest rates are almost always too low. So whether it's real estate, even buying a car, whatever you can borrow, if you can get extremely cheap money and you want it to be fixed rate so that you don't have any surprises, absolutely that, in my opinion, that would be the first move. The second move would be, put something hard, Bitcoin, gold, whatever you're comfortable with, and then look at stocks.
All right. Now, David is wondering whether you think Bitcoin is superior to gold. And if so, do you also think Bitcoin is superior to other cryptocurrencies?
I think it is in both cases. What Bitcoin has over gold is that it's unseizable. One commentator said, Bitcoin has no throat to choke, right? So in the case of gold, gold was seized. There is no country today that bases its money on gold. Why? Because gold is very easy to seize. It's physical. That means it has to be protected. That means you have a giant building with, moats and armed guards. Government knows how to find that, and it has. So, gold is, in a way, controlled opposition. Bitcoin, on the other hand, it cannot be killed. Gold can't be completely killed. I mean, even if the government, for instance, when the US government banned gold, you could still transact it person to person, but that's very, very limited, right? What you would have to hire Brinks to take your rent payment to your landlord, right? It won't work. So Bitcoin has the benefit that operationally it's very similar to gold, with the benefit that it cannot be seized, and of course that it can be transmitted over distances, in fact, much cheaper than a Visa card can. In terms of other crypto, I mentioned that earlier. I think they're way too risky right now. They're R&D projects. They're speculative plays for degens. Think of it like going to Atlantic City for the weekend. Any money you take with you will be gone. If it's not gone, you lucked out, but statistically it will be.
Now, Spencer is wondering, what do you make of today's FOMC statement by Jerome Powell?
So the Fed is doing what it always does, right? Which is that it works as hard as it can to create inflation. Usually it doesn't screw up the inflation this bad. It printed too much money at once to buy that COVID lockdown. But anyway, so it creates inflation, and then to rein in the inflation, it then has to crush the economy, right? So we get this inflation recession cycle. So the Fed's right in the midst of that. At this point, I think where they are is, they broke inflation. The goal of any, sort of manipulator is to stay out of the newspaper. A lot of people are getting angry at the Fed. Fed doesn't need that attention. So they broke inflation, then they broke the economy, sort of panic broke it to try to control for that. And at this point, I think they're really a deer in the headlight. So they, the way that they're putting it is, we're sort of calmly pausing to assess data. But another way to put it is you guys have no idea what you're doing. You don't know what's coming next. I think a lot of people think that probably the next move here is that something in the economy is going to break, whether that's, a top-heavy financial system, some piece of that breaking, whether it's the economy actually going into free fall. At that point, the Fed's going to have to lower rates. Given a choice between crashing the economy and ongoing inflation, they're probably going to go for inflation. It's less painful. There's less political pressure. So at that point, we could conceivably even go back to inflation together with recession, which would be stagflation.
All right. Now we have a Twitter account who is asking a question. So this is at Raystones23. That's Raistones 23. And he says, please explain a theoretical progression of Bitcoin adoption by masses in the US and world as a global currency. Specify how this progression can avoid being thwarted by governments, the state, which clearly understand that it threatens their existence. Thank you.
Right. So in terms of onboarding, that's generally with monies. That's something that sort of happens gradually. As more people come on, the volatility goes down. The volatility opens it up to more customers, more people switching over their assets into that money, and you sort of get this nice iterative process. Now, in the case of Bitcoin, of course, what complicates that is that governments are extremely hostile to it. They cannot kill it, but they can definitely slow it, right? They can do that by targeting the on-ramps, so specifically the financial sector. Thankfully, and I think this is really, as libertarians, our sort of most powerful tool, most politicians don't have a backbone. They believe in absolutely nothing. Normally, we find that disappointing, but in this case, it's useful. They really don't care. All right. Yes, there's this, entire financial edifice that benefits the big banks. They spent a lot of time and money buying it, bribing it from politicians. But today's politicians do not care. They will chase whatever they need to do to win the next election. So I think the beauty of it is that, the financial interests, the JP Morgans, the sort of deep state, these people may have a strong opinion about Bitcoin. Politicians, they're just like dogs. I mean, they will chase, wherever you throw the meat, they will chase. So I do think that there's an opening, and that the key there is to bring more people into it, bring more people onto the life raft, get them used to, what is Bitcoin? How do you use it? What is the Lightning Network? People don't understand how easy it is to use. And as you bring more people over, that begins to influence politicians. I think at this point, something like 16% of young Americans own crypto. That number is increasing every year. Every time the Fed does its screw ups, that number bumps up a little bit more. At some point, those little puppy dog politicians, they will follow the votes. They don't follow the money. They follow the votes above all. Without votes, you don't have power. Without power, you can't get any bribes at all.
All right. Well, we actually have some related questions to that. So Henry Kriegel, who is, he works with me. So this is great to see. It's a local question. He is wondering, he says that Montana Senator Daniel Zolnikov introduced a bill in the Montana legislature that prohibits discriminatory digital asset mining utility rates. It also prohibits local government powers related to digital asset mining. It prohibits taxation on the use of cryptocurrency as a payment method, and it provides for digital assets as personal property. And then Henry asks, do you believe states should implement laws like this?
Very strongly. I think that's excellent. Sort of as a general principle, digital assets should be treated just like any other commerce, right? There should be no discrimination. The government certainly has no expertise in running a business or in understanding what people want. So absolutely it should be treated like anything else. And indeed, commerce should be treated like all of our other fundamental rights, whether it's speech or voting. On sort of a moral level, I applaud it. And of course, I think it's addressing a lot of the threats that local and national governments are deploying against digital assets. And, they have sort of this knee-jerk hostility. I think a lot of that just comes from brainwashing that, people all over the world believe that central banks fight inflation, which is hilarious. If you look at how central banks are created, banks create them to create inflation. So either the banks are astoundingly stupid or they're not what they seem to be. But taxing digital assets as a payment method, that's something that a lot of jurisdictions are doing now. The idea would be that if you buy Bitcoin and then it goes up a bunch and then you go and buy dinner with it, then you have to pay tax on the difference. Right now, of course, that's discriminatory in the sense that when you go to Mexico and you change out your dollars to pesos, you don't have to do a return to the IRS every single time you buy dinner to show whether the peso appreciation has occurred. For that matter, when if you get paid on Monday and you go out for dinner Friday, the US dollar did fluctuate in purchasing power. Usually it got worse, but every so often you get deflation. So, you don't have to fill out a form for that. And of course, the reason you don't have to fill out a form for that is because it would be absurdly intrusive, right? Every single time you used a dollar, you would have to go and reference the CPI for the day you received the dollar. So digital assets should be treated exactly the same as paper confetti that governments print. And, the most logical way to do it is, exactly what's in the bill, which is to treat digital assets as personal property. Like your clothes, they are things that belong to you. If you buy and sell them, that's not something that's normally reported on your taxes.
I'll kind of add to this question a little bit because it specifically talks this bill based off of Henry's question here. It's talking about prohibiting localities from discriminatory digital asset mining utility rates. And I think what this is related to is the city of Missoula passed one of the most, I think it was actually the first of its kind in Montana, where they were actually punishing cryptocurrency mining because of climate change fears. Right. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little.
Yeah, it's part of a larger effort where I think the end game on that is to basically install a permissioned economy where you have to ask permission to do anything you want to do, right? So, I want to eat this, I want to go to this country, I want to, do this with my life, you have to get permission. And sort of for me, one of the poster children is how they treat, spontaneous street protests versus how they might treat, say, tailgating at a football game. So if you look that up on the internet, you look at carbon footprint of tailgating, they're like on this jihad against tailgating. They can't stand tailgating. My God, you've got people driving and sitting around in the open, barbecuing, right? This is just horrific to them. And but then on the other hand, if you have like an open air orgy, in San Francisco, this is brave and stunning. And so what accounts for this difference? Why does one of them have a carbon footprint? The other one magically has none. I think that's really what it's getting at, is that everything they don't like is going to be subject to this carbon footprint rule. And anything they like is, has sufficient sociological value that, we're just going to set that aside and forget that the carbon footprints exist. Another example is the private planes they take to Davos to go plot out their CO2 regime. And again, those absolute pass silence like it never happened because it's for a good cause. So in this case, somehow cryptocurrencies got on their bad list. Which, I mean, to me is kind of surprising. Like, crypto or Bitcoin is not inherently right wing. It's very much a little guy against, the banks. I mean, it's very much in the spirit of the Occupy Wall Street movement 15 years ago. So I don't know why these sort of NPC followers are accepting that framing, but at any rate, Bitcoin is on the bad list, and so therefore it magically has a carbon footprint.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And now moving on, Michael Crump is asking, how do we as a group for Austrian economic enthusiasts get Bitcoin adopted like gold and silver were adopted before paper money started circulating heavily? Taking the notion of fiat and paper money out of the equation, including CBDCs. Thank you.
Yeah, it's tricky. Historically, once you reintroduce gold or silver, that typically happens after some kind of crisis, right? So they really screw up fiat. People are desperate. They need something to hold on to, and then typically that's how you get back to gold or silver. So we would like to get to Bitcoin without having some cataclysmic crisis. And there, I mentioned earlier, the volatility will gradually decline as more people come on. Each boom bust cycle also brings on a lot more people. Those people automatically reduce the volatility again, at which point, Bitcoin can start being useful for, say, regular, saving or checking accounts, right? Checking accounts are usually pretty small. And then gradually, as the volatility gets better, it's good for savings. So, okay, you have this kind of gradual process, but you would like to accelerate that, right? So, one way to do that is regulatory. Lobbying locally, getting involved in politics, things like what Bukele did in El Salvador, right? Making Bitcoin dual legal tender. I think those are excellent. They sort of show the path for other countries. They show that you can do that, and the world's not going to collapse. So sort of leading by example. And one of the benefits in the U.S. is that we do have a federal system. Even at local level, you have quite a bit of power. And so to the extent that you can push those, for example, you were mentioning with the Montana bill, I think that's very helpful. And then other states can follow the lead, and you can start to get kind of a model legislation for other states, but also other countries to follow.
All right. And then Spencer is asking, besides centralized and government control, what is the difference between regular cryptocurrencies and CBDCs? Are there any other issues with CBDCs that don't just relate to the fact that they are centralized and controlled by government?
There are a huge number of issues. Generally, they come from the fact that they're centralized and government issued. But to illustrate, the structure of a CBDC, even if it's introduced initially with the banks dealt in on the, getting their cut, the sort of logic of the system is, why the heck do you need banks, right? Like, if you're holding your money in a CBDC, why don't you just hold your money directly at the Federal Reserve? Why on earth would you need a bank? And so it starts to resemble a little bit the public option during Obamacare, where you had kind of this government version of it that would chase out the private sector. So on the one hand, if banks collapse, that's not altogether a bad thing. On the other hand, what does that leave you with? Well, it leaves you with money, people's savings accounts, which is something like 10 or 12 trillion dollars, that would be deposited effectively with the government. And then the government would therefore, by necessity, have to decide how to loan that money out. And we already have very good indications of how they would loan that money out in the crony and ESG racket that they fund today. So I think that's really kind of an unrecognized risk, is that it would essentially transform the US financial system, at least the commercial banking system, which is most of the money. It would transform that into almost a Soviet-style Gosplan, where you had this sort of state agency that would decide how to allocate capital for businesses. And that I think is an enormous danger. One of the things I spend my days on is trying to wake banks up to realize this. The banks have been asleep at the wheel. Basically tell them, look, you guys have bought a very nice racket for yourself. Don't screw it up.
Well, I guess this is along the same lines, and I'm going to add to it a little bit. An anonymous person is asking, how badly did the Federal Reserve mess up this time what tangible things can we point to say the Federal Reserve screwed up and will not have a soft landing? And yeah, I know you've written about this. You have a Substack article about how bad the recession will be. So I'm wondering if you can just describe that article and make the argument for, I guess, like what's the time frame and everything like that. Are we going to be in a depression? And I guess a lot of that would depend on how the government responds. But yeah, what are your insights there?
Yeah, I think sort of the opening bid is the 1970s. I don't think the opening bid is the 1930s. The 30s were very unique because both the Hoover and the FDR administrations were extraordinarily interventionist, even much more than today's government is in where it mattered, which was wages. So I don't think that we're going to look at a 1930s situation. However, even if we're looking at 1970s, there's a huge additional risk compared to the 70s, which is that we have one heck of a lot more debt than we did back then, right? So debt as a proportion of the economy, debt in absolute terms is astronomical compared to back then. Our debt is actually even substantially larger than it was in 2008. I believe it was more than 3 times larger than it was in 2008, and compared to the 70s, it was many times larger. And so the risk there is that, our financial system in the 70s was nowhere near as leveraged as it is today, right? We had just come off gold very recently. It was a big reason why the 70s happened. And so banks sort of hadn't gone long enough to really get comfortable in their new, bailout-proof world. At this point, we've had 50 years of it. And so I think that what a lot of people are concerned about is that something is going to break in the system. Of course, that's not just the US. I mean, essentially every industrial country in the world is massively over leveraged. The EU, Japan, China, essentially everybody is massively leveraged. And the concern is that if one thing starts toppling, then others could fall behind it. And it's important to remember that, what happened in 2008, so that was mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. Before the crisis occurred, nobody on Wall Street had ever heard of those. All right, if you watch the movie The Big Short, talking about Burry, the guy who predicted it all, he was trying to buy these things, and everybody on Wall Street was like, what is that? I don't know what that is. And they were kind of spitballing in the back room like, hey, how much should I charge this guy? I don't know. Charge him a lot. Ha ha. All right, these guys had no idea it was there. All right, so in other words, and that's what destroyed the world, right? So the question is, if you had that gremlin sitting in the machine that even the experts at Wall Street did not know existed, all right, how many of those do we have this time? Nobody knows where they are. The Fed certainly doesn't know where things are. If even Wall Street doesn't know, guarantee you nobody knows. There's probably one or 2 Michael Burrys in the world who knows what's going to blow up next. So that's my biggest concern, is that we start with the 1970s. It's really worldwide this time, and then that causes something to break that gives you a domino effect.
No, I'm going to add a question. I didn't send this to you, but you did bring up Michael Burry. I wonder if you saw his tweet from the other day, and I wonder how you reacted to that. He sent out just one word, sell, period, and it was trending on Twitter. So if you didn't see that, I just wonder what you make of that, because it caused quite a stir.
I love him in many ways, but his record on predicting asset movements has been poor. So, an A for presentation, but honestly, I don't put any weight in his opinions. I don't know. It's like Peter Schiff, right? There are guys out there who are perma bears. It's kind of their brand. It's their thing. The sky is always falling. And then when they get lucky and the sky falls, then, they kind of run off that the rest of their career. So I listen to him, but for something like that, I wouldn't take it too seriously.
It's pretty funny. I think that was the only tweet on his feed, and then he deleted it like a day later. So it was pretty dramatic.
Got this minimalist thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, so we're going to start wrapping up after a couple more questions. If anyone watching now wants to submit some questions just in the comments, please do, and we'll get to them. But we'll try to wrap up with some of the ones that were submitted. So Fernando M. DeAndrea, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He's asking, what are good schools to go to learn and apply Austrian economics, especially at the graduate level?
Yeah, so I went to George Mason specifically because it has so many Austrians on faculty. So that's outside of Washington, D.C. It's a relatively cheap school. It's a state school. I didn't regret it. There are a lot more undergraduate programs. Hillsdale, for example, Grove City College. King Juan Carlos in Spain has at least one prominent Austrian. But I think if you want to study Austrian economics and you don't necessarily want to go to one of those, generally, you can look at the faculty of other universities that you want to go by or others that are nearby you. There's often one or two Austrians on the faculty, so places like Florida State, University of Southern Florida. A lot of these, they will have an Austrian or an Austro-friendly person on staff. And just reach out to them, right? Email them, do a phone call, go and visit them. Professors respond very, very well to personal visits. It's so rare that they will conclude that you're passionate on the subject and they will try to help you. And remember that when you're going into say, a graduate program, you really only care about one person, which is your advisor, all right? You need one professor. That professor is going to get you through. They're going to protect you and shelter you from the storm. Even if everybody else in the entire university hates you because you're a crazy Austrian, you just need one person, and then they're going to take you through the process. So always keep that in mind. It also means, choose by advisor. Do not choose by program, not for your grad school and not if you're going for love. In other words, if you're going because it's Austrian economics, don't choose based on the school rank and things like that. Choose based on the advisor.
Someone commented, Mises U. It's not a graduate program, but I highly recommend this as well. If anyone is in their undergrad degree right now and wants to learn Austrian economics, there's a week-long program during the summer in Auburn, Alabama. And I graduated from it twice, and I have this book right here. They give it to you, and it's like just they have excerpts of all of these Austrian works. So you get to read some of Mises, some of, I think Rothbard might be in here. Yeah, what has government done to money, I think is in here, to our money. I highly recommend that. And then we do have some questions trickling in. So Dave is asking, I read about experiments with local currencies in a slightly older book. Does that idea have any life these days?
It is done sometimes. It's usually basically a gimmick to attract tourists. Miami was farting around with, I can't remember the name of it, but some local coin, Miami coin or something. I think Martha's Vineyard or Cape Cod, places like that, they'll do kind of regional currencies, Key West. Generally, it's a gimmick. It doesn't really have legs. And the reason is, generally because you can't actually convert it into anything. Right. So typically what floats those schemes is that you get a discount, right? So local businesses say that they'll accept the whatever Key West coin at face value, and you can buy them from the tourist office at 5% off, or they're generally structured in this way. So those are pretty gimmicky. Now, of course, Bitcoin, on the other hand, I think is different in the sense that you can't exchange it for something physical. What you're really buying with Bitcoin is access to a specific network. And in fact, that's also what you're buying with the US dollar. Right. So if you come into the U.S. and you're trying to use Bolivian pesos, you're going to incur transaction costs, and 7-Eleven is going to resist them. So what you're really buying, if you're Bolivian and you visit the U.S. and you buy U.S. tokens, you're not saying that you love U.S. tokens. You're saying that I want access to a network called the United States. And so Bitcoin, I'd argue, is effectively the same thing. It's a network coin. And that is giving you access to a network that in this case, I think is a superior gold.
All right. And then it looks like someone is saying that Mises U offers a master's degree program now. I did know that, and I neglected to mention it.
I did as well. I recently learned that. Yes, that is correct. So massively endorse the Mises Institute. In any chance you get to go over there, there's a lot of really clear minds over there. It's an excellent organization.
Yeah, and then just to wrap up with a final question, this is actually a holdover from previous ones that we've done, but I think it's just good to get this question asked by everyone. What are some non-Austrian books that you would recommend reading? Is there anyone that you, and I guess like while we're at it, another person has asked what is the best Austrian book to read. So if you have one Austrian book to recommend, what is it? And then a non-Austrian one as well.
Okay, Austrian book is easy. That's Man, Economy, and State by Rothbard. The content is similar to Human Action, but I think Rothbard is more readable. So I would recommend starting with that. If you want to understand the Fed, again, I would stick with Rothbard. The Case Against the Fed, extremely readable. Ron Paul's book was, I think, basically structured on that. That is sort of the Bible. All right. And you can tell I'm a huge fan of Rothbard. So pretty much anything Rothbard has ever written is amazing. In terms of non-Austrian books, most of what I read is Austrian, of course. The Forgotten Depression, I don't know that he identifies as an Austrian, but that's probably going to be quite interesting. He's talking about the 1920 Depression, which the presidents at the time, the Depression happened over two presidencies, and both presidents were for different reasons neglecting the economy. They were either sick or they were lame ducks or they just weren't into it. So that was Wilson and Harding, and they did nothing. And the economy snapped right back. Like, they had this real rough patch for 18 months and then just came back like gangbusters. I mean, it just went crazy. We had an entire decade, the most electric decade of the century, the Roaring 20s. So that's pretty fascinating because I think that we're coming into that kind of episode here. If the economy does go into a serious recession, then they're going to dust off the old playbook. They're going to cut rates. They're going to increase government spending. And I think that book really nicely illustrates that both of those actually make the problem worse. They stretch out the pain, and they mean that the pain is never entirely fixed. You've just sort of patched it over, and your car was falling apart. So instead of fixing it, you just kind of paint over it, and then you pump that sucker up to 80 miles an hour again. You're going to crash again.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on with us today. Why don't you just tell people where they can find you on social media and elsewhere? I've also linked to, I believe, your Twitter, your Substack, and your Mises profile in the description.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm at Heritage. That's why I write a lot of my work. We've got some great economists over there. I'm also active on Twitter at Prof Stonge, PROFSTONGE. And then my Substack links out of there. So that's pretty much how you can find me.
Awesome. Well, and to everyone listening, go over to askanaustrian.com. Please submit questions for future episodes. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to us on YouTube. I believe we're also on Odyssey, and then all the podcatchers. We're going to be upgrading this and also changing the look of it, maybe even the name here in the future. But definitely stay tuned for that, and then subscribe to us on YouTube. Specifically because that is the hub for all of our stuff. If we have speeches at events, they're going to be there. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it. And then also just make sure you subscribe and keep submitting questions. We're going to be watching the private chat and the live chat when the podcasts are streaming, and I'll keep track of them. And we do have a long list of ones that haven't been addressed yet, but we need more, and we're going to keep inviting guests on, and we're very excited for where we're headed. But I appreciate you joining us today, Peter.
It was a pleasure, Liam. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.